Hello and welcome to Nourish. My name is Kasha and I'm a holistic counselor and first-year doctoral student studying acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. My mission with this podcast is to share the stories of inspiring humans who have discovered that elusive state of balance between the Western concept of success with more Eastern philosophies of inner knowing and spirituality. Think yin and yang and flow. Now, these two do not need to be separate, but I know firsthand how difficult it can be to reconcile them. As a Silicon Valley burnout SKP myself, teaser, I left the tech world after 10 years of a thriving career in product management. I want to share the stories that I wish I had heard when I was struggling to find that balance and flow myself. My hope is that these interviews can inspire you to rethink your own approach to mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. And if you are struggling, find your way back to authentic alignment. So, sit back, relax, and ground yourself back home, my love. Now let's get started. I am so excited to share my next guest with you all, Stephan Rechtschaffen. Stephan, or otherwise known as Dr. Rechtschaffen, is the co-founder of the renowned Omega Institute in New York, one of the foremost yoga and meditation centers in the world, author of the bestseller Time Shifting, which is all about our relationship to time, and the creator, director, and visionary behind Blue Spirit, which is a yoga and meditation center located in Nosara, Costa Rica. Stephan is a remarkable leader in the space of longevity, well-being, and he's an expert in living an aligned life. We dive into so much of his inner and outer evolution on today's podcast with beautiful wisdom for all you seekers out there. Today's episode covers Stephan's journey of taking those uncertain, major life leaps of faith, his path to founding Omega and Blue Spirit. We talk about designing our lives from the perspective of inner alignment and contentment as opposed to focusing on just achievement, how we should be reframing failure, how to be an action-driven individual to co-create the world we want to live in, which is quite a hot topic given everything that's going on in the world. How can you come from a place of equanimity, but also take action? And so much more, y'all. Finally, on a personal note, this is such a full circle interview for me. I met Stephan in 2012 at Blue Spirit, his retreat center, when I was on the first of very many yoga retreats that I attended there. And I just remember having this profound experience of really reconnecting to myself for like the first time ever. This was very early in my career. I was finally starting to see, what happens when you put in a lot of effort into something that you're working on. And I would say I was still at the bottom, but I was rising pretty quickly. And I just remember feeling like I was living two lives, like the life that I was experiencing and living on this retreat where I felt so connected to myself. And then the life that I felt when I would go back home, reintegrate, win the awards for whatever things I had just achieved. And these felt to me like they were just such separate parts of myself. And I remember at this retreat, running into him, telling him how much I loved my experience and just saying, oh, I wish that I could live here. And I don't think I meant specifically living at Blue Spirit, but just really living such a life of alignment, to have left a medical career to go and create these beautiful retreat centers, to have both the inner and outer success. And, it just seems so elusive to me. And it is just so exciting to be able to have this full circle conversation, reflect on that question, and really dive into the evolution of kind of our lives and the evolution of our perspective, because 2012 was a little chunk ago. So this is such a beautiful conversation. I'm so excited to share it with you all. And now without further ado, let's welcome Stephan to the Nourish podcast. Stephan, welcome to the Nourish podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Kasha. It's great to be with you and happy to be having this conversation.
Likewise. As I'm sure I've stated in the introduction, you are somebody who has really impacted my life in ways that I actually didn't expect when I first met you at the Blue Spirit Retreat Center, where I remember I had run into you at one of the retreats that I was at, and I've already been there several times ever since then. So shameless plug for how incredibly transformative this place is. But I remember that I was saying, oh my gosh, I wish I could live here. I wish I could stay in Costa Rica, live this kind of a lifestyle, really be immersed in kind of a lot of the information that Blue Spirit puts out and the incredible speakers. And I remember you said to me, why not? Why can't you? And that just threw me for such a loop. I was like in the height of my tech career, or not in the height. I was really kind of like a rising star. And I remember that stuck with me, that question to this day. So it is just such a full circle moment to be speaking with you right now. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here. But before you ask me questions, I want to know, so what's your answer to that now as you've ruminated on that question of why not?
Ooh, that is beautiful. Well, I would say that the answer for my younger self would be I didn't know that it could be possible. And I think that there was a lot of fear associated with going against the grain at that time. And even to this day, there's a lot of fear associated. A little bit about my story, but I've actually left that tech career that since 2012, because I went to Blue Spirit in 2012. That was the first time I went. Since that time, I invested so much time, energy, resources into building that tech career. And now I've actually left it, but at the time I didn't think it could be possible for me. So I think it was not allowing myself to see the possibility and then the fear associated with the different path, honestly.
That's great. And I meet with a lot of people over the years who have these moments of, I've been in this one place, am I going to switch to something else? And do I dare? And I love to tell the story of something Damien Brinkley wrote where he said, life is like being on a trapeze. And at a certain point, you're swinging on and you know you need to jump to the next one, but you don't see it. And so are you willing to take the risk? Because if you don't, you're going to go back and forth in that same spot and the momentum will stop. And before you know it, you're 80 years old and you've been doing the same thing forever. But so there's a certain level of risk taking, and it's not pure risk, but it's listening to the inner core of what's most important to be following. So I know those big jumps. I've had many of them in my life. And the truth is, as you get better at jumping, you start to develop a kind of resilience and capacity to trust your inner knowing. And so it seems like that's what you've done, having left the tech career and being willing to move out into what is your current future. And who knows where it will lead you next. Perhaps it will get you to Costa Rica, or it's not that Costa Rica is the only place to go, but who knows where life will lead you. And that to me is one of the real great opportunities and excitements of our life.
So beautifully said. We're definitely going to be getting into some of those leaps that you've taken because I'm so curious about them. But before we do that, I always love to anchor with a question that I ask every guest because it kind of gives a frame of reference for our audience as to who is speaking. What are 3 words that you would use to describe yourself?
I think, God, I've never distilled it into 3 words, but I would say curiosity, depth, and it's not one word, but good mood.
I love that. And it's just so interesting hearing them because it's like you have this perspective of the person on the other side. And every single time I ask this question, it always surprises me. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
All right. So we're going to jump into actually kicking it off with the topic you just brought up, which is a lot about, that leap of faith. And so you are trained as a medical doctor. You're an author of Time Shifting, co-founder of the Omega Institute, Blue Spirit. You're a creator, director, a visionary. And so for so many of us who are kind of familiar with the world that you're in, you are really kind of a human being who almost like represents this whole space of like well-being and living kind of an aligned life. Can you share a little bit about your path, trading in, I guess, the traditional path of medicine for the life you have today? And I know you mentioned just a second ago that you've taken several leaps. Is this kind of one of the major ones that you've taken as you kind of reflect back on those leaps of faith? I'd love to hear about that.
Well, I think with the leaps, and we can remember in our childhood when we first got on a bicycle and we were so shaky. And then after a while, you ride the bicycle and you can't imagine falling. It becomes so natural to you. So as we learn skills, we get far greater capacity in being able to not only do what we've been doing, but go to the next level. So life is really, really that. And I would start the arc of my life is my grandparents took a leap coming from Eastern Europe, what was in Poland and now Western Ukraine and those areas, because of the pogroms, because of all the things that were unraveling there. And so they came to America. And as I watched, I'm second generation now. So I watched my parents having really strived to make it. And yet, even in that striving, there was a certain trying to fit in. And that was very important for them at that time. And I really honor them for that and the really great life that they set up as a result for myself and my siblings. Yet it also was clear to me that I had that gene or feeling within that I wasn't going to just settle into one thing. I was really going to follow the dreams or the visions that were part of my life. And how that started to show up, I became, in college, I was part of the 60s generation that got all into the psychedelics and experimentation and then getting into meditation and so on. And I went to medical school. And when I was in medical school, I was already starting to look at alternative health, because clearly the problem I have with modern medicine is it's focused very much on, it's run by the pharmaceutical companies, essentially. So if you're sick, you get some medication. The studies are done by the pharmaceutical companies, and doctors basically get their post-medical education by the pharmaceutical articles they read. So it became clear to me that when I saw a patient with hypertension, and he was a young guy, I remember, he'd been given an antihypertensive, but he clearly was stressed. He was running a new business. He was not doing any exercise. He was eating lousy food. And his doctor said, just stay on your medication. So it was clear to me that there's something deeper, and I started to move into that. Now, at the end of medical school, I didn't know how it quite happened, but I guess I stood out in some way as somebody looking for something different. A parasitology professor came to me. I had not taken her course. And she said, I've been noticing you, and I think that you might be interested in going abroad for 4 months to work at some hospital. She said, where would you like to go in the world? And I blurted out immediately, India. So this was in the early 70s. And it's an interesting one. These are these moments where life, and we all have this, life presents you something. And you can either say, nah, I'm happy here. I have a nice apartment in New York where I was going to medical school. I could just stay here. I had a girlfriend at the time. This is good. And it was good. But the opportunity to go to India, and I ended up in a hospital that was 8,000 feet up in the Himalayas. And it was where Tibetans were coming across. And I got to spend time with someone who I've been told about, who lived on the floor, an Indian saint, who lived on the floor of the local temple. And he was an incredibly learned being. He had been a professor, but he was imprisoned with Mahatma Gandhi during the Satyagraha movement. And so I had the opportunity to work in the hospital in the morning and then spend the rest of my day with him. He really didn't have any students. He was just somebody who was dedicated to his practice of meditation, of being with God. And so I spent every day with him. And it was extraordinary because, as I've said, he was quite learned. And from him, it sort of set me further. It's not that there's one moment that your path changes, but it just sets you further on that path. And from there, it became my devotion to more of a spiritual life, one where the inner life is as important as the outer life, because too many people in our world now have the expectation that if they get their outer life together, they're going to be happy. And so we see people rushing to get billions of dollars. And it's great on some levels, I'm sure. I don't know that directly. But I don't see a real sense of contentment and happiness from that. There's still this kind of striving and not being okay with one's sense of self. So spending time with him and then coming back, what I did was I spent time with the Sufi master Pir Vilayat Khan, who asked me, after I'd been in India, he asked me to set up a commune. And so we ran a commune called The Abode. It was an old Shaker village. And from there, we started Omega Institute. And so one thing led to another. I was practicing medicine. I was doing alternative medicine. Back in those days, I was doing home births. I was the only home birth doctor. And there was one other guy. He and I were the two home birth doctors we would cover for each other. And it was just an extraordinary experience. It was an outgrowth of the whole psychedelic hippie movement, but it was something that really, I think, had a lot of power and purpose. And while I'm really glad not to live in a commune anymore, it was an experience, and I didn't want to stay there. And so as we began Omega, the purpose of Omega was, and came from Teilhard de Chardin. And Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit monk, brilliant person who talked about when humans recognize the power of love, it will be like discovering fire for the second. And so Teilhard de Chardin also talked about the Omega point. And the Omega point is when all of consciousness interconnects. Now, there are many people in the digital world who look to him as their prophet. And so for us, it was about how do we create people to be more connected? And so Omega was a place where we had incredible teachers. And this was for me, one of the most powerful things in my own life was the opportunity to spend time with really deep thinkers and really very powerful teachers. And I got to know them. Sort of the job of running a place was I got to know people. And the interesting thing is I got to know the teachers not only when they were in front of the curtain, but I got to see them behind the curtain. So often there were some teachers who were totally different behind the curtain. And my great respect was always for those who were the same either way. It wasn't that when they were in front of an audience of 500, they were one thing, and when they were talking to you, something else. They were demanding about something. So I had the opportunity our board of directors included people like Ram Dass, with whom I became very close, and Joan Halifax, who I'll be seeing very soon, who's the Zen Buddhist teacher, remarkable woman, now turning 80. But we even had Nobel Prize winners who would come. We had astronauts on it was sort of a wild time. It was something new because previously the type of center that Omega was, there was Esalen out in California, but Omega was in the East Coast, 2 hours north, is still 2 hours north of New York City. And prior to that, gathering places were usually of a religious type. So we had Jesuit monasteries, we had yoga centers, we had things like that. But what we were trying to create was something that really did not say one was right and the other was wrong, or this is your only path to God, or this is your only path to enlightenment. But let's bring together all of the different facets of consciousness, of wisdom, of deep thinking, and let people share in groups and so on. So that was really Omega, and that was started back in, I think, 1975, and I continued there for quite some time. Now, Omega was, tell you how I got to Costa Rica, which is that Omega was only operating in the summer. Basically, we took over an old Yiddish cultural camp that had gone defunct. And so we could only open for 4 to, and then finally 6 months a year. But in the winter, all the pipes were above ground and people wouldn't come. So I started running programs in the Caribbean every year for 6 weeks, just so that we had something going on where people could come and remember us. And we would run lots of conferences around the country. But with the Caribbean program, quite honestly, and that was the opportunity for another jump, I just loved it so much that I thought I wouldn't mind setting up a place year-round. I went all over the Caribbean. And when I came to Costa Rica, there was something so viscerally profound that I felt here in Costa Rica. And to this day, I'm only more admiring as the world changes, as the world turns, and we see the difficulties in our world at large. I feel it's the small countries where wisdom still prevails. It's the small countries where caring for people still prevails. And that led me to being here and knowing you see, when I first came to Costa Rica, it was Oscar Arias, who was the president then, had won the Nobel Prize. And so all of a sudden, Costa Rica became a known place. Now, the history of Costa Rica is that 75 years ago, President Figueres abolished the army. Costa Rica is the only country in the Western Hemisphere with no standing army. It may be the largest country with no standing army. There are some countries that have pacts with others, so they don't have to have armies. But for a totally unaligned country, it's quite large. Now, the impact of that is profound, especially having lived in the United States and visiting now and seeing what's going on, because people here are actually in good mood. I find that a rare condition in the United States right now. There's always something everybody's upset about, and with good reason. Whatever side of the aisle that you're on, there's plenty of things to be upset about, but good mood seems lacking. And so people feel undefended when there's no army. There's not this kind of tightness that happens when you come to the customs in the United States, or you talk with a police officer, where there's a little kind of like, okay, I better be on. But here, there's a little more human flow. There's not the immediate assumption that there's a problem. Now, the money was instead in Costa Rica was given to medical care, so that it's a country with socialized medicine. It also went into education. And the remarkable thing is that for Costa Rica, it has a literacy rate higher than that of the United States. And Costa Rica is not a country that is just tourism. Its major export, strangely enough, is medical devices. So it's a very highly developed country in that way. It still has its sort of back in time kind of feeling, but I love it. And it is a committed green. It's one of the few countries in the world that not only is maintaining its green, but it's expanding it. And the daughter of President Figueres, Christiana Figueres, was a remarkable woman, become a very close friend. Christiana, she actually led a movement when the multinationals came down to Costa Rica and started planting palm oil, cutting of trees to grow cattle, monocropping, pineapple, things like that. So major forests were decimated and just cut right up. So the forest coverage went from over 70% down to 30% in a matter of a few years. And she's now led a movement that's brought it back over 50%. But she also is the author of the Paris Climate Accord. So it wasn't isolated to here. It's also about what can we do for the rest of the world? And so she, to me, is one of the people I most admire for her incredible vigor to say, we're going to do this. We're going to take care of climate change, and we're going to set an example that this can be done. So to me, my coming here was in part because I wanted to live in a place where I could feel more aligned with the ideals of the place. And while the United States is based upon fantastic ideals, it's gotten so politicized that one has trouble seeing people speaking the truth as opposed to just speaking for what's in their own interest. We have such great wealth and such great poverty. We have such high ideals and then people just out for their own. This is a kind of situation we live in right now. And while I would love to do whatever I'm capable of doing to help that, and I go to lots of meetings of just even recently in the United States to see where is our next steps forward to a type of way of living that feels looking positively into the future instead of thinking, oh, things are just going to get worse. Because from the height of the 50s and 60s, it's really been a pretty downhill slide in the United States since then. And yes, more money, yes, more stuff, yes, more billionaires, but overall, the feeling is not yes, better. So what can we do? And so I'm trying to do something here, and that's why I set up Blue Spirit.
There's just so much around what you just shared to dig into. First of all, I love how you are leading by example in that you're explaining that this is how you wanted to live your life. And so you kind of chased after that to not just live it for yourself, but to be in an environment that really does support the types of initiatives that you are aligned with and to really participate in that. I think the kind of element of action is just so crucial. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and this kind of segues pretty well to one of the topics that I wanted to discuss around longevity and wellness and really thinking about that holistically. I know that Blue Spirit is established in a blue zone, and you talked about how some of these smaller countries are places where, quote, wisdom still prevails. And so I would love to hear from your perspective. And there's a beautiful book that I've read, which I highly recommend. I'll put it in the show notes around blue zones. So I became more familiar with what they are. But can you share with us what is a blue zone? And when you talk about the wisdom that still prevails, how does that translate to day-to-day life? Is it the way that people interact? Is it the way that they eat? Is it a combination? Yeah.
One of the things in terms of the jumps that I've made, and I want to say this for anybody who's listening, that the jumps are never assured. I went bankrupt once on a project. There were times I thought I was utterly crazy doing what I was doing. And partly what it's about is the road less traveled. What we're looking for is to explore in our life what calls us. And so one doesn't necessarily know what that's going to be. But one of the things I wrote about in my book about time is that in order, I would see so many people who've done successful projects and said, I want to change and do something else. They leave what they're doing, as you did, and move into something else. But at first you go, oh my God, this is never going to work. When I first came here to Costa Rica, I went, this is never going to work. And it might not have. But it's the willingness to risk and the trust in oneself, as you've done, the trust in oneself that you're going to move forward in life, because this is what matters most. And that willingness is not necessarily how much money you're making, how secure it is, but trusting that if you follow deeply your instincts, you're going to be okay, even for those times when you're not.
So I actually want to pause for that. We can go back to the other question I asked in just a second. You mentioned, and I'm so glad you brought this up, by the way, because this is just such a pertinent topic. You mentioned failure, going bankrupt, and then you also talked about trusting your own innate wisdom. It almost seems like those two things like don't align, right? If you are putting things out there, you're taking the road less traveled, and we all know that it's not that easy and there are failures along the way. How do you continue to trust? What has worked for you in terms of building that trust or cultivating it when you're down and everything isn't working out? Yeah.
Well, one thing is to look at people around you, because this is partly what I get inspired by. Look at people around you who are actually happy and content in their life. I often find some of the local people here in Costa Rica seem more happy and content and at ease than many of the billionaires or multimillionaires who are striving. Because when one's in the state of striving, it's never enough. Once one's hit $1 billion, how much more do you need? People keep wanting to be the biggest billionaire. And I would be okay with that if people felt at least good-natured, or at least maybe taking care of somebody else with their fortunes and the good opportunity that's come to them. So it's really the question of checking in with our inner life, not just what the world is giving us as carrots to come, you'll get this if you do that. So some people, for whatever reason, whatever they do seems to manifest great. And we've all had slips. So in the project that I did where I went bankrupt, the project was fantastic. It was just to the point way back in the Carter administration time when the interest rates went all the way up to over 20%. And then all of the money that we were borrowing vanished and the project collapsed. It probably still would have been a great project, but it was a learning episode. We learn more. The truth is we learn more from our failures than our success, because our failures, when you fail, you really look at it. When you succeed, you think you're invincible. And I can do this, and I can do that, and I can do that. So I look now, I'm often having people come to me now because of the success we've had here, who would like to see me do something else like this somewhere else and so on. And I'm generally saying no to them, that I'm happy to give them some advice. I don't even care about being paid for the advice. I'm happy to help, but I don't want to go do it because I'm actually content. I don't need to have a chain of 10 blue spirits to be content. I'm content with one, and I'm content with the life that I have. And I don't want to get that confused with, because if one's happy, you don't necessarily need more. I mean, there's a certain level of money we'd like to have. There's a certain levels of comfort we would like to have. I'm not putting any of that down. But once you get to that point, people don't get happier by getting more. Actually, they feel more stressed about it much of the time. So learning from our mistakes and keep following the inner, like checking in, how do I feel? When I did that one project that went bankrupt, it's an interesting story in my life. I remember it was about an hour and a half away from where I was living. And this was while the project was still going well. I remember driving there. It's the only time in my life I did this. I remember driving there, and as I'm driving, I take my fist and I hit it into the steering wheel. And I said, Stephan, don't do this project. It's not right. But somebody was backing a dream that I had, and there was lots of money, and there was lots of da-da-da-da-da-da, and I went ahead and did the project, and it failed. Now, I didn't listen to my inner self. And so we are so caught in our mind that the feelings and emotional life we have are often just because we've felt when things aren't aligned and aren't right. But then if the promise of success and money and fame and this and that is there, we see people so famous in the world who seem to be living lives that isn't so happy, but they're pushed, but they're not content. So we have to really start to evaluate what is contentment in life and how do we create contentment. And many times, so I'm not saying just take any risk, but many times that's really following the inner wisdom to see what's going to make us most happy in a true sense. Not happy like, but happy in terms of really deep content.
So really getting to know thyself in order to recognize what that is. Yeah. I really appreciate you calling out actually the perspective that you share on failure, which is that you actually learn from your greatest failures. And I know people say that, but it just kind of hit me a different way when you just said it just now, because it's almost like if you're on a roll and everything is working, there's like this element of, and I think you mentioned, you're invincible and anything can happen, but that's not actually the way that the world works. And I don't even mean like in a practical sense, like it's just completely unsustainable for everything to be going your way all the time. It's almost like there's like a unnatural sense of force in that versus looking at the failures as not, oh my gosh, I failed, but okay, in this particular way didn't work. What can I learn from it? I think that's the fundamental reframe that we need around failure, right? Because my question was, how did you keep going when you kept failing? It's like you were on the ground. How did you get up? But it's that reframe that makes all the difference. I do have a juicy question for you though. Okay. So Stephan, I so appreciate what you're saying around, and there's so many studies to back this as well, for those extra sciencey listeners out there around, what really brings contentment in terms of how much money you need to make. There's kind of a tipping point where once you have a lot of those basic needs met and you're, let's say, living in alignment, you're feeling happy that, kind of an excess of that doesn't make a difference. But I do want to call out the fact that you are, so accomplished, right? You truly are, right? With Omega, Blue Spirit, your books, like the lifestyle, you're accomplished on an outer sense. And also it sounds like an inner sense. And so I would love to hear from you as somebody who obviously does have that visionary aspect. Even when we talked before this interview around some of your passions with the green initiatives, which we'll dive into, talking and sharing about longevity, like these are all visionary things. How do you balance kind of having that visionary aspect to yourself where you see something in the future that you want to create and put out there and reach people, and there's like that striving to it. How do you balance that with the almost more like, I don't know if the term is Zen, but like the sense of contentment, right? Because in many ways, those are like two sides of the same coin, maybe, right? Like yin and yang and flow. That's the main theme of this podcast. So I'd love to hear from you. How do you balance those two sides of yourself?
It's always a work in progress. So it's not that I got it down, but it is life evolving itself. And so I'm continually learning in that process. And the more you put yourself into these situations, the more you learn. And if you're clear enough about it and willing to reflect on what happens and do an inner search, you start to get more skilled at what you're doing. I mean, we look at these baseball players who make $100 million or something like that in a year. When these batters hit the ball, if their batting average of 300 is what they get, 1/3 of the time they get a hit, they're paid $100 million. Now, that means that 2/3 of the times they failed. So we don't have it where we're going to always be successful. But one has to be clear. When I set up Omega, that was a nonprofit, and it still is a nonprofit. When I came to do Blue Spirit, I was going to set this up as a nonprofit as well. I wasn't able to do that in Costa Rica, so I had to get some investors and partners and so on. And so it became, surprisingly to me, very successful financially. And that was really the first time, in a way, something like that had actually happened. So, but again, my focus was I wanted to live well. I wasn't trying to be a billionaire or even a millionaire. There was no, so the balance of what's important has to be continually refined. I want to live a good life where we have enough to eat, we have a nice home, I can travel. So yes, I have certain aspects of life that in the way I live is beyond what lots of people have as a capacity for them. But it didn't come because I was chasing money. It came because I was chasing what I wanted to be creating in the world. One of my very closest friends in life, who's now in his mid-80s, is a world-renowned sculptor. And he's from Holland, and he started doing these little projects, making fountains to make some money and so on, until all of a sudden he makes these metal 30-foot high sculptures and gigantic sculptures that are, in the front of museums or libraries and so on. It wasn't because, now he likes to make money doing it, but that's not why he did it. He could have been creative in business, really, but he was following his artistic. And so what I love about my friend Hans in that way is that when he wakes up in the morning, and I'll visit him in his home in the country, and his practice is he'll bow to the first animal that he sees, the first bird he greets. So he sees life. Our problem in the world right now is that we see life somehow when we talk about the environment and how we're damaging the environment, we think of it as an it out there. We think of it as just something green out there, and that we should protect it because it involves us. That's not true. It is a being. Just as we are human, humans are so caught into thinking we're the only things that matter. And there are the beings of the planet, of life on the planet. There are trees that live to be 10,000 years old. If we're lucky, we live to 100. That's 1/100th the lifespan of these trees. These are beings on our planet. These are the creatures of our planet that have perhaps more wisdom than we do. And so becoming aligned with things like that, really recognizing. And so many people have had to remember in their childhood of a time when things were unsettled in their life. And what they did is they went and they sat next to a tree with their back up against a tree. And all of a sudden, things became easier. When we connect with nature, so many people have the feeling that, when they're really upset, you go walk in nature and somehow there's an inner cleansing takes place. And that's not just, because I was quiet or I was walking. No, there's these beings, there's life out there. See, it's not that the people of the jungles who have lived there in the Amazon for so long and in so many other places in the world, it's not that they were primitive because they couldn't be different. They were primitive because what we call primitive, I don't in the slightest think it was primitive, but they were in touch with their surroundings in such a way that they felt part of, it was all one being. And they didn't, like the Europeans coming to the United States and so on, they weren't striving because they were happy. They were content. They weren't trying to build mega cities or get richer. Life was full enough for them. And I think that our striving that we have to be bigger and better and all of that is our discontent and unhappiness. And that's really where the focus of our life needs to be. What makes us truly feel at ease in our being?
It's a fantastic perspective on both, actually, to recognize like aligning with, and you used your friend Hans, right?
Hans, yeah.
Yes, as an example of, okay, how does life want to live through me, and balance that with kind of what's motivating you as well, right? Because it seems like he's such a perfect example of allowing that to be the guide, and look at where it's led him in terms of, both outer and inner worlds. And it just sounds so aligned. So, and then constantly doing that full circle to check in, is this aligned with, kind of what's true for me, as opposed to, what my neighbors have versus what I have.
It sounds like what you're doing in your life.
Yeah.
Having moved from one thing. So this is the process. And then you do something for a while and you see where it moves. It's not static.
Yeah.
You don't live in the time where you start as something and you necessarily end your life that way and say, see you. It's like we're continuing to grow through, you don't just grow to be 21 and I got out of college and now this is who I'm going to be. This is a lifelong process. And to me, we started to touch on longevity and the blue zones. To me, a lot of it is still having interest, curiosity, openness to what's new. That we're not static in that every day for breakfast I have the same thing, every day for lunch I have the same thing, and so on. No, life, that's okay if you do. It's just that life is open. If life is at play, more play is what's needed.
I love that. So I do want to share something that I know Kasha from a few years ago, and many people who are actually in her situation from the past today are probably thinking, because I like to channel a little bit of that, right? And you mentioned, some of the wisdom of the blue zones. You mentioned your perspective on life. And for a lot of people, and you can even think back to that girl who said to you, oh my gosh, I wish I could live like this. And you were like, why can't you? And I was like, oh my gosh, that's completely unfeasible. It feels like such a leap. And like part of it is the way that our lives are designed. Part of it is, like just years of societal, familial programming. I mean, there are just layers, right? And not all of us, as you mentioned, like that resilience kind of builds on itself. For people who are where I was, and now you know where my head was at in that time. And by the way, I remember after that retreat, I came back and I was so shell-shocked of like witnessing myself just like really feeling in tune and aligned, coming back to this like work environment. I actually won several awards like a few weeks after the retreat. And I remember just being like, oh my gosh, like I'm being told I'm doing this great thing, I'm on the right path, but something feels off. And I stayed in that path for many, many years, right? And so I know that there are people who are just like, wow, something's off, but I don't know what to do about it. And I don't live in an environment that makes that easy, because that's not the way a lot of us live. Like by default, it has to be a conscious choice. What would you say to them? Like, how can they start to tune into their own inner voice? Maybe start to tune into, some of what you described, that wisdom that you talk about that is found in these smaller countries.
Well, I love the way you speak about it for yourself, and just to use it for you is that something sort of ripens like a fruit. It's something just opens up and it's there, and you can no longer make believe it's not there. So sometimes they're just seeing something, no, I'm doing well. I'm getting all these rewards. I'm making more money. Don't bother me. So many people are successful. I wouldn't call it successful, but are competent in getting rid of that voice. And they become people with less and less feeling because they're living continually in the mind. And our digital world doesn't help us this way because what happens in the digital world is we're going faster all the time. To keep up with the digital world, we have to go fast, fast, fast. Now, the mind can do that. The feelings and emotions are happening at a different speed. So it requires to you to start to say, okay, I'm going to relax. You go, okay, I'm relaxed. So it's a different level than the way the mind works. So something happens there. For instance, when somebody goes through a crisis, maybe it's a health scare, maybe it's something that happens to a breakup in a relationship, something happens to a loved one, they go through a bankruptcy, some kind of shock happens. People wake up from that. I'm not saying everybody has to go through a catastrophe for that to happen, but these are the kinds of things that wake us up to where am I living my life? And unfortunately, our modern world is telling us, is training us to go faster, go get richer, get all the things, the outer things you need. And there's very little support for the inner life. Gabor Mate comes and teaches here every year. Bessel van der Kolk, John Halifax, Dan Siegel, all of these people come and teach here about the fact that there's so much more unrest, trauma, these issues in life that we look around, the number of kids nowadays who are suicidal, depressed, are in institutions already at young ages for no reason. And this is the way our world is right now. So we are in a very, very delicate place. And what it takes, unfortunately, because we can't work with a large group and get a change. It takes one by one people waking. And so what you're doing and trying to, reach out to people is like a message of how do we get more real with ourselves so that the values we're getting don't have dollar signs to them. The value we're having is the degree of contentment we have. And that's a very different thing because the world, when somebody has 1 million, 7 million, 10 million followers online, they are seen as successful and know what they're talking about. When all they're necessarily doing is just advertising and being able to say something in a way that's very catchy and has me all excited and whatever. And so how do we get deeper levels of truth happen, deeper levels of meaning, which is what I see you wanting to be doing. And I think it's great. It's what the world needs more and more. And one has to just take enough time to feel into it. And sometimes that time initially, I don't know if this happened for you in the shift you made, but sometimes when you start to do that, it's like, oh my God, my thing, it's never going to work. Maybe I was crazy to do it. You go into almost a depression and so you go through that, but you have to go through that because those are the feelings that haven't been nurtured or nourished all this time. And one has to go through some of the dark feelings. Creativity really happens when we empty ourselves and then something new arises. That's where real creativity happens.
Oh, I can relate to that on so many levels. So many levels. I mean, it's like a breakup. It's like you're breaking up with what, like who you were, your lifestyle, your beliefs for so long. And there's so much doubt. And then there's like that moment where it settles and it's like, well, would you want to turn around and do it again? And it's like, no, just a little voice in there. Yeah. Oh, Stephan, this is such an incredible conversation and so deeply validating for me personally. And I know for so many people listening to this podcast, because this is such a core theme. I feel like I could speak with you for hours, but I want to be mindful of your time. And so just as we kind of bring it home and wrap it together, I would love to hear from you. You're such a visionary in this field. You may not call yourself that, but I can call you that. So there's that. What are you excited about? You mentioned that a good mood is one of your core values and you have that positive outlook. So as you kind of look to the future, because there is a lot of pain and grief in our world, what are you hopeful about what's coming, and you can speak personally as well from the Blue Spirit point of view. What are you creating and bringing into the world that you would love for people to experience? Share with us what you're excited about.
Well, it's interesting. I've been most recently, because I have 3 sons, I have 3 grandchildren, and I'm certainly concerned about the world that they're, especially the grandkids, coming into. And so most recently, I've been looking at what are the directions in which our world is going. Is it spiraling down toward Mad Max chaos? Is it spiraling down to more totalitarian regimes? Or if there's a future, what is our future? And how can we help to co-create that future? And so from my own perspective, I have a belief that the smaller countries are the future. Not to say everything has to break up, but I think the smaller countries are more human. We had the president of Costa Rica actually visiting here in Blue Spirit last year. Just such a nice man. And I then heard a story about him that he still goes into the grocery store to go shopping. And I thought, that's great. That's really great. That's still being like these, you don't have to, everybody makes my dinner for me. See, it's like we're still being human. So I'm interested in how, and I've been working with some groups, especially in Sweden, and now tomorrow talking with some groups in South America, just about what are the ways that we can create preservation and leadership from that which is still wholesome. And how do we start to be really bringing that more out into the world? Now, I can't tell you I have any idea how to actually do that. I'm actually just wanting to work with people who are aligned that way so people can start to dream a future for us, because I think too many people look into the future and it feels bleak. I mean, maybe it doesn't feel bleak in terms of the digital world because that's going far ahead, but that's if we want to replace ourselves with robots. But I tend to want to look at it in terms of how do the human values that we cherish get to be more part of what we value most in our lives. So that's where I've been, like I even look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. And I say what's recently struck me is because I know in the West here, oh, that shouldn't happen, Russia shouldn't do it. There's much more to that. When I look at Ukraine, the values it represents should be stirring us all, because what they represent is, to me, the potential for the future, where it's people who really care about each other and really are trying to create good life for their community. And that's what, if we don't allow, then it's being gobbled up by the big corporations, the big companies, where one works in a big corporation and you're just another cog in the wheel. And you may be getting bonuses every month and sales as it goes up, and everybody feels the goodies of that. They don't really like it. They're just in a bigger scheme where the boss is in, or the leader country. So how do we look to and support those people who really are doing it not for the money, not for the power, but for the true human values? So any way I can be of support to that in my own little way. And that's what I try and do now with Blue Spirit is, while we have many of the similar programs we've always done, I've started to move into programs that are more aligned with that, where people can come together and be dreaming more what the future holds for them. That's it for me.
And thank you for taking the initiative to do that, because that's what we need. And I think this is an incredible call to action for anybody listening. There's absolutely no way that this conversation couldn't have stirred up some deep-rooted emotions. May they be your inner voice, may it be something that kind of urges you to connect with humanity. And so what a beautiful call to action. Stephan, thank you so, so much for meeting with us. It was, meeting with me, the plural of the entire audience, but it was such a pleasure speaking with you. And to everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in.
It's so nice to see you again, and that you're doing so well and continue to be so radiant. So I hope I see you in person next time. Okay.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Nourish. If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a positive review. Your rating really helps the podcast grow, and your feedback means the world to me. I publish new episodes twice a month, so hit the subscribe button to be notified. Finally, if you'd like to learn more about the work I do as a holistic counselor or to connect, please head over to my website or my Instagram at Mira_wellness_co. I love speaking with each and every one of you. Thanks again for being a listener, and see you next time.